Live. All right. And we are live. Welcome, everybody, to the Queen's Podcast Learning Seminar, Queen's Podcast Labs Learning Seminar. My name is Joseph Cohen. I'm from the Sociology Department, and I'm joined, as usual, by my colleague, Jason Tugoff from English, co-director of the Queen's Podcast Lab. And we have a very special guest from Media Studies, Amy Herzog. Welcome, Amy. Today, we have the good fortune to be sitting down with one of my favorite young sociologists of culture, Rachel Skaggs from The Ohio State University's Barnett Center for Integrated Arts and Enterprise. Rachel is a great researcher. I love her work on the sociology of culture. You might know her from some of the episodes from interviews in the annex that we've done, and obviously you know her from her work. When we last met with Rachel, she was studying the country music industry. We spoke a few years ago, and we're going to be delving into her new sociology work next week on an episode of the Annex Sociology podcast. This week, though, we're going to delve into the more applied side of what Rachel is doing, and Rachel with her colleagues out at the Barnett Center. It's a project that merits our attention at Queen's College. It addresses some of the goals that the school has of developing its arts and business programming. It really does both. And it seems quite similar to the collaboration that's been developing between sociology, English, and media studies through the Queen's Podcast Lab. Beyond that, Rachel is in an applied space that's a very, very interesting opportunity for sociologists with interests in culture, digital, markets, organizations. It's a space where we can help real world people do real world things. And it's a very exciting opportunity, or I think it's a very exciting path that Rachel's taking in her career. You know, for in a space that I think we often hear there's no place for jobs and no room for applied stuff. Rachel's showing that's totally different. So without any further delay, welcome, Rachel. It's great to see you again.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here and glad to get to talk shop about some of this other work that really is applied facets of the research that I do, that's driven by the belief that artists can have sustainable careers. I think it's a little cliche, but this idea of the starving artist, I think there are ways around that. And that's what I hope to push forward in my research and in this kind of more applied setting of, service and teaching and curriculum development.
Yeah, you know, I see this type of work as pushing back against a fatalistic view. I think there's a lot of people who say platform capitalism is turning all creation into piecework and nobody can be an artist. And I guess that's true when you think about, like, there might not be journalism jobs or paid staff writing jobs in journalism, but there's a lot of opportunity out there, and we're gonna jump into it. It's very, very exciting. Maybe before we start, Rachel, can you tell us about the Barnett Center? Like, what do you guys do? What are you trying to achieve? What's it like?
Yeah, sure. So at Ohio State, my home department, my academic home is in the Department of Arts Administration, Education, and Policy. And the Barnett Center kind of stemmed from that, from a huge gift from the Barnett family. So Larry and Isabel Barnett, Larry didn't graduate from Ohio State because he was drafted into World War II. Once he came back from the war, became this, big kind of money man and business guy in Hollywood. But he saw people like Frank Sinatra, Judy Garland lose money and not have the career skills to back up their artistic talent. That they, had great careers and then maybe didn't always have, the business skills that they needed to capitalize on that. And so he and his wife's gift, and she was a Tony Award winning Broadway actress, like fabulous. They're great. I mean, all of the stories and photos are beautiful and exciting, but they gave money to really bring together the entrepreneurship side of the arts. So with the intent of training students to have business skills. And in some of my research from like the sociology side, we find that essentially people who graduate with an arts degree have enough artistic training, like they feel very confident in their artistic skills, but there's a huge gap in how they feel they need and got entrepreneurial and business and finance skills. So it's kind of this kind of research and historic basis for what we're doing. It looks like a lot of different things. So in the curriculum space, it looks like having an arts entrepreneurship minor that is available to students from all parts of the university. So in my most recent arts entrepreneurship class, I had students majoring in economics, communications, real estate, in addition to some of the arts majors you might expect. So doing curricular programming with those students, but also co-curricular work with undergrads and graduate students. So the Barnett Center has what's called a field school. That's kind of a practical application space for grad students to get self-directed entrepreneurial time and money and resources to really bring together the things that they feel like they need. So right now that looks like doing a panel on programming for cultural diversity in arts organizations. So bringing together relevant speakers from museums, an emeritus professor, and other people who they want to hear from. And this gives kind of an unstructured or lightly structured space that allows for resources to fund entrepreneurial action related to the arts.
What do you say to people who, either students or colleagues, who say, listen, art is not business. The business is not relevant to art. I am teaching people how to express or create themselves. They're not business people, or they say, I don't need business skills. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so I think the first way I'll respond is that I always ask my students at the beginning of the semester, I have an agree or disagree, generative conversation with them. And the first one is it okay for an artist to sell out? And I think for a lot of us who grew up maybe before this generation, we might have a strong response to that, and be like, yeah, artists should not sell out. Be true to your mission, be true to your vision, be true to your voice. I can tell you that none of my students have ever agreed with the statement, artists should not sell out. They're very critical of that idea, and they are ready to capitalize on their artistic vision. Sometimes I'll also ask about networking, like, is it okay? Does it matter who you know? That question. And they agree that it does matter, but they're also like not opposed to the idea of networking, building community. So I think there's a shift in the way that students see themselves as creators. So whether or not you think it's like piecework, whether you think it's selling out, I try to shift that into thinking about artistic vision as something that can be, so your artistic voice is also something that can be equated to a market niche. So if you're trying to reach people with your specific artistic vision that is meant to evoke particular feelings, communicate a unique message, to me, I think that that's directly comparable to what you're doing as an entrepreneur, seeking a market niche, seeking to meet people with a product, a resource that they have not had access to in the past. So that's my mission that I'm trying to push forward in that space. And I think it's successful. I think they're buying it. But also I think they've been successful. It's kind of a conversation that's starting to catch on that students feel like is valuable.
First of all, before we go on, I just want to say, if anybody has questions either on YouTube Live or here, you can put them in the chat box, or you can just raise your hand virtually if you have any follow-up questions for Rachel. So you study and develop tools to help creative people, artists, musicians, all of them, learn the business of creating and sustaining a livelihood from it. Like, is it possible though? Can people really survive? I mean, you hear so much about how there are no jobs, and Web 2.0 has destroyed media outlets and gainful careers, and that everything is just piecework. And do you agree with that view, or can artists develop livelihoods, in your opinion?
It's certainly more difficult. So I think that in a lot of the arts industries, especially in the entertainment side of the arts, that it's what's called a superstar economy. So you see these highly famous people. You can apply a lot of kind of economic principles to, the distribution of success in these spaces. However, this is a really good time for indie artists. So whereas there might not be as many opportunities for someone to become the superstar, which there never have been, right? There are never that many opportunities to be Beyonce, to be Andy Warhol, to be any of the superstars. That's just the reality of it. It always has been, but also increasingly so with the kind of, tech changes that lead to a more democratized media space. It also means that while it's harder even now to become the superstar, there are more opportunities to make a living and to kind of put things together in a way that allows for a sustainable career. Does that career look like a 9 to 5 in a corporate organization? No, absolutely not. And that comes with its own set of challenges. Like, I think that the career, like a portfolio career in the arts, putting together, monies from, let's say, public grants, also maybe some private funding, also selling your own work and perhaps selling your time in gigs, you might have to pull all of those things together to make a living, but it is possible. And I think it can look good. There are ways that it can look good. There are ways that it can be a sustainable career that does give autonomy and creativity a space. But perhaps it also means that you do have to sell your work, your time, your vision to a company in a way that is not just your own creative vision, right?
So it's like you can't easily become a millionaire without doing work, but if you engage in sort of business practices based on your art, you could become a person who does this professionally in some capacity and have the reward of being an artist for a living.
Absolutely, yes. And have some space for your own creative vision, your own autonomy, or applying your creativity, whatever that looks like, however you define creativity, in your work. But at the same time, you might not be, full-time in a studio or full-time performing. Like, there might be waves and you might have ebbs and flows of what types of work you're doing. So that is challenging, but it's also something that I think we can prepare students for. I think that if you didn't grow up around artists, like, what does that look like? What does it look like to be an artist? When I was a child, I thought I wanted to be a ballet dancer for a while, which for many reasons, didn't happen. But I can remember my mom saying, that doesn't make money. But also my mom had a degree in graphic arts, and, there are only some ways where that can make money. My dad's a songwriter. There are only some ways where that can make money. So it really is not just the skill or the kind of artistic discipline that matters. I think there's some general principles of business and of occupations and really sociology of work that can really get behind ways that we can train and help people develop the skills and also dispositions that they need in order to carry on a sustainable long-term artistic career.
I didn't know that you were the child of artists. That's really cool. We got a question. Seth Shire. Seth.
Yes. Hi, Rachel.
Hey.
A question. You're using the term artist. Could you define that maybe a little more closely? I mean, do you mean people who paint, people who write?
Yeah. So for me, and this isn't everyone, and I think sometimes I get some pushback, but I define art very broadly. I think people who are creating, performing, managing, educating people in and around cultural, creative, and artistic work, to me, all count as artists. And typically, if you were reading my writing, you'd see me say that in a more direct way up front. So with the data set that I use, the quantitative data set that I use, SNAP, Strategic National Arts Alumni Project, they have a very broad view, and that's kind of what I go with. So people who do visual arts, performing arts, media art, communications arts, as well as architects, designers, arts educators, arts administrators, and managers within the arts, and art historians too.
Oh, okay, great. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
What about faculty? Like, I get the sense that, we're very much in this space as well. And a lot of our behaviors, our professional behaviors, resemble the content creators that Ryan and I have been observing. What's your feeling on that?
Yeah, I think we're in a similar space, right? So again, I'm a sociologist of work primarily. And so if I'm thinking about what occupational structures look like in the arts, I think faculty map on quite well to some pieces of that. I also believe that faculty need to be entrepreneurial. I've had conversations about this all throughout my graduate training. I think that increasingly everyone must be entrepreneurial, which is why artists, again, broadly defined, occupationally, are a really good case study or case for study if you're trying to understand the new economy and new ways of work. Artists have been likened to canaries in the mine for what work conditions look like for people. And I think we're seeing that with the gig economy, the platform economy. These are things that artists of different types, let's say musicians in a gig economy, they've been using that terminology and that work style for decades. And so we can learn a lot from the ways that they organize their professional lives, their workplace identities, their schedules, in ways that now are really applicable to quite a large portion of our labor force.
Yeah, it seems to me, your answer strikes me like it's not necessarily that opportunities are shrinking in an absolute sense. It's just that there are different skills that are required to survive, and the very talented artists who waited for someone else to pluck them up and elevate them might not be doing as well. Whereas maybe somebody with stronger business schools can compensate or do well despite being less
Yeah.
talented than that person with
Yeah.
those skills.
Exactly. So having creativity, having creative skills, being able to paint, being able to sculpt, knowing how to work with materials, whether those be sonic materials, physical materials, choreographic steps, those are only one piece of the skill portfolio that's needed for a creative career today. So it's actually kind of difficult for people who are practicing artists, working artists or creators, because not only must you be, you have to have something to say, whatever that looks like in your art or in your content. But in addition to that, you have to do your own taxes. You have to understand copyright and how you can legally engage in the world. How can you be referential toward artists who you appreciate from the past in a legal way? How can you incorporate collaborators into your work? And can you be sued for it? I had a student who was very concerned after our day about LLCs and other potential like ways to organize your work. She's like, oh my gosh, I had someone get injured at one of my photography sessions. She was my model. I paid her. Am I liable? And yes, yes, she is. Luckily, some time has passed. We think that she's in the clear. The person seems okay.
Yeah.
However, that's a piece of the skill that you wouldn't anticipate if you think photographer. There's a lot that has to go into making them successful, but in turn, that also makes them, more marketable, not just for their artistic skill. Their value goes beyond that. So it's a lot to learn, but also does bring with it, once those skills are acquired, the ability to use and market those skills in addition to the kind of creative lens that they might apply to their work.
Do you find that some of the young people who you train eventually find sort of standard jobs and they insert artistic creation into their job portfolio? Like Ryan and I have interviewed podcasters who they're like, listen, we're theater kids and we wanted to perform, and we basically found a marketing department that would pay us to do live events and whatever. And they're still artists, but they're doing it as professional marketers and they're earning like a good living instead.
Yeah, I think that people should do that. And this is when we get into people complaining that like, oh, an arts degree doesn't lead to a job. I think that's such a limiting view, because if you like, don't you want a doctor who has like a creative way of seeing the world? Don't you want someone to be, expressive and intuitive and across the board in all jobs? I think that maybe it's Stephen Tepper who advocated for the arts being like an arts degree being, similar to a business degree. Like it's a portfolio of skills. It's a way of seeing the world that can be applied across many different types of occupations. I like that. I think that it's good to think about people in obviously a marketing department being creative, right? You need like different ways to sell things in creative ways, but also thinking about people, in hospitality, people in the travel industry, people across the board having creativity. It's seen as this like special sauce. Like people want creative people, but we're also hesitant to say that no one on this call would be hesitant to say that, but that there's something that you should avoid about kind of studying or learning the arts in higher education.
You know what's interesting about that conception of creativity? So we were talking to Hannah Wool last semester, and she was studying like those no sense for business artists, the weirdo type of artists. And she found that creativity itself was basically just product piloting. Like they were basically creating mock-ups of products and basically test marketing them, seeing which ones got good returns, and they would build on it. And it's almost like the difference between test marketing and creativity might not be as great as people really understand or assume when they hear those words.
Well, I think we want to think artists are really special, right? Like, I think that, there's this historic conception of artists as being a genius, someone who's separate from other people, someone who works in isolation. And sociologists, I think we've been really good at pushing back on that and saying, no, like artists are responding to and contributing to society. Artists are in community. They're not special. Like we're all creative, they can make special work. I think everyone's special, right? Not just artists. And that by separating the idea of the artist away from other people, it makes that gap, sometimes difficult to fill.
So let's talk about the curriculum that you guys train people in the Barnett Center. So
Yeah.
when an aspiring artist comes to you, can you just give us a bird's eye sense of like your curriculum and how you see it as developing the artist into something that can succeed more?
Sure, definitely. So this is where the kind of departmental home of arts administration, education, and policy kind of fits with the Barnett Center. So the Barnett Center itself is not does not offer curriculum.
Okay.
However, the department's very closely linked to it. So if we're thinking of artists and students across the board from all different majors, they might come to the arts entrepreneurship major and say, I'm trying to get a degree in the Fisher College of Business, but really I want to be an artist, but my parents also want me to get a business degree. So that's often the story that we get. Or, someone from the music department, well, they have actually their own entrepreneurship minor in business, but we are in music, but we work together with them too. But across the board, they might come to us and we hope to give them kind of a broad education that's skills based. So I was, I think, hired to bring some of this more entrepreneurial and for-profit sense to the curriculum. It's historically been a lot about managing arts organizations. So thinking about especially nonprofit, especially community-based organizations. So we have a lot of strength in that department. Likewise, that's where a lot of jobs are, especially a lot of first-time jobs for students who they graduate, they're practicing their own art on the side, not even on the side, but in the time that they have to practice it, and might be working for an arts organization as their day job or as their kind of salary generating activities. So we certainly have curriculum about how to manage arts organizations, how to manage social media for organizations and for artists, how to manage board relationships. So how do you get grants and how do you manage kind of who is directing the ship? But I'm trying to bring to this entrepreneurial side. So I developed just a class called Arts Entrepreneurship, which you would think in an arts entrepreneurship minor would be there, but you know what, we're pushing forward. So that class, I was actually kind of not scared, but wary that it wouldn't be allowed to be offered because it's not curricular in the sense that you're going with this, literature, scholarly tradition over time. Like it's all very new. It is based on research, but it's also new research from the past 15 years. But it was incredibly successful. The purpose of the final project of the class is earn $100 doing something creative and legal. And you have to add that on, like, please do something. I don't don't turn in a project that's illegal. I feel like it might happen if you don't say it. So that was the thing. But the whole class up to that is built around how to support students as they test out their ideas. So like you said, product testing. Students think they're going to go viral on TikTok. One student thought he was going to be able to sell an NFT and make his $100 that way. However, he wasn't a digital artist yet. So you have all of these things where students have the idea of what they can do, and they haven't had the opportunity to try it out yet. So it's a space where students are able to iterate, pivot. So my student who wanted to do an NFT ultimately decided his photography skills were better serving the goal of the class. And actually earning the money is only a small part of their grade. It's not like you're going to fail if you earn $7. However, you have to do a lot of reflective writing around that, which I think is an important practice for any student who wants to have a job in this space, being reflective and really being self-critical. So looking back at reflective writing and thinking, how could I grow? Where am I not pushing myself? What's wrong? Like what is wrong with this strategy that's not working? How do I pivot? How do I change? And why did only 7 people look at my TikTok? Okay, maybe that's not my best marketing strategy right now.
Right. It is a path of self-discovery. Like we find, I think Jason would agree with me. We get kids who come in and they want to be in front of a camera, whatever. And then by the end of the experience, they're like, you know what? I'm a web programmer, or I want to cut video. And I think that experiential, those types of experiential opportunities allow the student to find where in the big machine of cultural creation they want to work.
Right. And they might not know about those things. I mean, in a real way, students come in knowing what they haven't interacted with in the past. Yeah. I mean, how would you know that you wanted to be a video editor if you've only seen people in front of cameras and haven't edited video yourself? Yeah. You might not know that exists. And so I think being exposed to those sorts of things, whether it's through an internship, project-based education, or kind of, going it on your own and trying to do the whole process, I think going through the whole process is really valuable. Writing a marketing plan, figuring out like, do you need to pay taxes on your $100? Like just asking that question and letting students figure out what that looks like. I think is very valuable to have them work through something that they might not have time for. You know, our students are busy, they're working regular jobs. They are taking other classes. So without having the space to take risks, I think that's one of the big things about this space is allowing students the space to take risks without having, horrible consequences if they fail.
Yeah. College in general, I think, is like, it's like an adult incubation center sometimes.
Totally.
Or like
Yeah.
So I have one more question to ask about curriculum, but I wanted to give anybody an opportunity. If you have a question about educational programming related to arts and entrepreneurship, are there any other sort of questions related to that? All right. Oh, Jason? All right, go for it, Jason.
Thanks, Rachel. This is totally fascinating, and I think our students would definitely be interested in this. Our students definitely don't have a sense of selling out as like a horrible thing.
Right.
But the thing I'm curious about is a lot of what you're talking about. It seems to me artists often have gained through communities, artistic communities.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious about which happen in a kind of like loosely formed kind of way and are a little different for everybody. I'm wondering how your curriculum kind of relates to that kind of the community stuff that artists are involved.
Yeah. So in addition to, so I'm only in my third year at Ohio State. So this is, a job that I was brought in and luckily was allowed to develop curriculum. So in addition to that arts entrepreneurship class, the other course that I've developed for undergraduates is called the Social World of the Arts. It's cross-listed in sociology, but it is sociology of art and culture. But in that class, it's really focused around what Clayton Childress would talk about as creation, production, and reception, these kind of three spheres where the social world of the arts is important. So in that class, the students engage very heavily with the idea of a social world around creation. So like having artistic peers, having a horizontal, you don't just want to connect to that superstar in your field. You want to, what songwriters would call come up with your class. Like you want to have almost a cohort model of people who can help you refine your skills, give you feedback, and also provide opportunities. They're those connections who might bring in new information and opportunities to you. Now, the next level is the social world of the production of art. So having like that big machine, like how do you need to work with an editor? Do you need to work with a producer? How do you connect your work to an audience, that kind of intermediary space, which is often, when you think about, oh, it's who you know, I feel like that's what people are talking about. Like, do you know someone who can help take you from creation to reception and bridge that space? And then finally, the space of reception or audiences, consumption. I know that some English faculty have told me they don't like hearing sociologists talk about consumption. They think about like horrible Victorian things about death. So I think reception is a good term that maybe is more interdisciplinary. But in that space, thinking about how people engage with audiences, whether those audiences be, recursively their own peers or critics in their field, other gatekeepers, or whether it's really like the audience of people who engage with their art as a fan or as what we would think of as an audience kind of watching, consuming the art. So my course does that. In the past, it has been, more theory heavy, like we read a lot of sociology and I get to put really cool things in front of them. But now that we're back in person and living life again, this fall, we're going to be working with a local YouTube, superstar, really. He has millions and millions of followers. So the students in the first half of the class will learn that framework, this social world of the arts framework, and then work with a content creator to apply that framework to one video. So they have a video and it's not out yet, but it's going to be kind of their keystone video for the year. And we're going to interview the creator, so the person who's on the camera, but also I think we're going to visit their office and, look at the editing bays and looking at this kind of production side. And then looking at the reception. So I think the students will want to look at the comments on the video. And when I said that to the creator and his team kind of laughed. And so I think that it'll be interesting for them to look at the comments and then ask the creator, to what degree does this matter?
Yeah.
But yes, absolutely. This kind of social embeddedness in community is really key to my own research. So of course, I'm putting it forward in my curriculum. I think that having them understand community in all of these different ways and how they might fit into it gives them a really a better pathway. If their jobs aren't going to be based on employment, they're going to be based on community. So that's something that I think is really important for them to learn.
So a lot of people on this call are interested in realizing a similar vision at our school, and I got to tell you, everything that you've told me about what you're doing out there has just got me all pumped up. Like, it's so cool, and I'm just really in awe. But
I feel lucky to get to do it, right?
Oh my God. So, I mean, it's something that I can just see the appeal of, and I think it would be great for our school as well. For those of us who are interested in developing this type of programming at our schools, what type of advice would you give us? Like, what were the big sort of lessons you journey of developing this program that might help us avoid pitfalls?
Yeah, I think one is just like I said about students being open to risk and iteration and product development, that, it really does take time to realize the vision of it, especially those partnerships, like embedding ourselves in our own communities takes time. So luckily, you all are already embedded in your university community. So I think that I, as someone who sees myself as entrepreneurial, looked to those people in the university or people, programs, initiatives that were well aligned with my goals. So I think looking at where our curricular needs were, so students had said it's too focused on nonprofits, we need more for-profit, and it's too focused on visual art. So I initially kind of started pushing things towards student interest, but then aligned that with the kind of initiatives and partnerships that were possible in my community in Columbus. That was hard to do during COVID, and I am new to town, but it's something that has taken iteration and will continue to change and grow. So I think aligning yourself with the interest and needs of your community, which it sounds like you're already doing, is kind of the first step there. But I think also, whatever the curricular content is that you're trying to use, I think it was really helpful for me to think seriously about what resources I had in kind of instructional design and pedagogy. So for me, I took quite a few classes and read a lot online about students as producers of knowledge. So this is a movement that I've seen in a lot of teaching and learning centers at different universities. And then there's the whole scholarship of teaching and learning on that. But that allowed me to reimagine what student products look like. So what does a final project look like? That could look like earning $100. Okay, so if I can't grade a student on earning $100, how can I measure learning? Which had to lead me to very extensive rubric writing around reflective writing for students. So I think that has been really helpful for me, that kind of backward design pedagogy around what does a student product look like that will be useful for them. Because a final paper, I don't know that it's that useful to them. It would have been useful for me, but I became an academic, right?
Right. Let's shift gears and talk about you doing this work as a sociologist. Hold on, I'm sorry about that. I'm sure it's somebody who wants to tell me that my car dealership or my Visa MasterCard is expired, whatever they're telling me these days. I apologize for that. In our discipline, there's often a strong sense that I think there's a non-favorable view in some quarters towards business or applied oriented work. I think there's even maybe said as a form of disparagement. That's not universally the case. For example, I don't want to speak on behalf of all of Queen's College, but philosophically, applied work is at the center of what we do. But it's not always like that. What's it been like for you to move into an applied field? Do people guilt you? Do they make you feel bad for it, or have your colleagues been supportive, or how's it been?
Yeah. So I think that first, I've aligned myself throughout my career with mentors who really push me to understand what I want for myself. And so that's taken a lot of the inner work of do I need to go to this institution? We all seek prestige in some ways or another, but really aligning what do I want? with what your actions are. So luckily I have mentors that I've cultivated who support that. But yes, absolutely. I've had a lot of people ask, like, when are you coming back to sociology? And I publish, I publish in sociology journals, but I also publish in arts focused journals. And I think as a scholar, I have to separate the audience of my work to those two spaces. It's been really useful because it allows me to use my data for public interest, right? For things that might impact higher education policy, let's say. But then you can write kind of the theoretical, generalizable sociological take on it too. And again, I went to Vanderbilt to work with Stephen Tepper, who is a sociologist who is now the dean of an art school. So I already, again, kind of worked toward that type of a career. But I do have people who ask, when are you coming back? And I'm like, I never left. Here I am. And that's fine. People can think that or not. But I'm also in an applied department. So the department that I'm in does licensure for K through 12 art education. So they are already very, oriented toward application and jobs. So it has not been a difficult sell in the department that I am in, which makes the work a lot easier. I feel like I have a lot of freedom to do this type of work or to train students. But I think that's my disposition too. Like, I think have you ever done the thing of like, if I weren't an academic, what would I do? Yeah. So mine is that I'd probably be like a college career counselor. Like, I like helping people get jobs. That is part of my mentorship. That's part of what I do with and for my friends. And luckily they hired me to teach about it too. So I already like that kind of thing.
Just so you know, though, on the as far as we at the Annex, we targeted entirely sociology. You're actually a good draw, so you're still central to the discussion. Just so you know, if you have any inkling that like you're out of the loop, you're actually quite a draw. And I really admire what you do, because I see it as real innovation and a way of us taking. It's basically the culture of production and making it useful to the world.
Yeah.
It's extremely exciting. And the only question I have is like, could we create more avenues where people who do the production of culture could find spaces like that?
Yeah. I think so. I think that one of the things that would help with that. Okay. So number one, like, we're all academics. Like, if a student seeks us for advice, like, we're not trained to give advice. Like, we can only really help people with the things we know about. So that makes us limiting in that way. All of our students are not going to be academics, and it's easy to kind of trick ourselves into thinking we have this broad knowledge and like broad access to helping people do whatever, but we're not specialists in that. And so I think that for us ourselves, having conversations with people in artistic fields and content creation fields, just to stay grounded with what is kind of really going on. I would say in my own research and practice, the way that I do that is asking people for 30-minute conversations. It's not part of research. It's never data. It's just like, what's going on? How can I produce research that's useful for you? Whether that be for organizations or individual artists, like, what could I do that would speak to you? So again, I'm allowed to do that because I get credit for doing policy relevant research. But I think that sociologists especially want to be policy relevant. I think a lot of us put in the last paragraph of our papers, like, this is relevant to policy because, but if we don't know policymakers, if we don't know people who will be impacted by that, it can be disconnected. So staying in touch with actual people and organizations, I think, is a very practical way to work toward that, at least.
Yeah. You know what? Your answer really resonates with me. Like, in this research and podcasting, I mean, there's been a field experiment component where we just ran a podcast network to see how it's going. And like, it is very humbling because you realize once you actually try, you're like, oh, there's all sorts of stuff I don't know. Like, I had no clue that the folks at, like, it was this project was my first exposure to both like the details of what they're doing at media studies and English. And I was like, oh, that's a deep well. Like, that's so far out of my league. Like, you realize that you're only good at some stuff.
Yeah.
And I think if you don't break out of sociology, you assume that the totality of the world that you're talking about is what you're discussing.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think that's something about communication too. Like, I think if you sit down and like have a coffee or a beer with somebody like from a different field, you can get to those similar pieces, or with someone from the public, but it can be really difficult to do that translational language, whether it's because of jargon or because of like focus on theory that's not necessarily relevant to their theory. So I think that that's actually very challenging, and that I wasn't necessarily trained for that in sociology. I was lucky to work at a center similar to the Barnett Center at Vanderbilt as well. So I was, trained by a Victorianist. He wrote one of my letters of recommendation for the job that I have now. And I think that's powerful too, cultivating people who can speak on your behalf and speak about the importance of your work to and from different perspectives. So I think that's valuable, especially for graduate students who are thinking about being academic entrepreneurs, but also for students who are thinking about how to be a content creator whose content is relevant to more than just themselves, which can be a challenge for them sometimes, I think.
Now, did you overlap with Peterson when you were at Vanderbilt?
No, unfortunately, I think that so my dissertation was about country music. My undergraduate thesis was about country music. And I think I started reading Peterson right around the end of his life. And so it's, it's really sad, but I feel like I got to, bask in the legacy somewhat. Yeah.
Vanderbilt, just for non-sociologists, Vanderbilt is probably the central institution in a subfield that both Rachel and I are in, which is the production of culture. And that's the subfield of sociology that examines how the conditions in which people create information or culture shapes the content of what we see and discuss. So it looks at sort of like the business of it. It really is the business of it.
Yeah.
It's 100% sociology. Yeah.
Yeah. That's why you and I are both a little bit more agnostic about what the arts are, about what creation is, because that perspective necessarily is very social and very structural, right? So thinking about what does digitization do to the content itself? That is broad. That's not just something that can apply to painters or sculptors or musicians. It's across the board.
All right. So we're almost out of time. And I just wanted to give if anybody has any questions for, yes, Amy.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is fascinating. And I especially love the way you're bringing in the social aspect and the cohort community building aspect of that. That seems really valuable. I'm wondering how you balance preparing students to find fulfilling jobs with, on the one side, the exploitation of the gig economy, which tends to impact artists more than really any other field I can think of. And also then on the other side, the hunger for corporate partnerships by the administration without always thinking through whether that corporate partnership is actually good for the students or if it's just a money-making venture. I would imagine that would be a really tough balance to strike.
Yeah, I think in terms of what are we preparing students for, that's a conversation I have a lot across my department, because we're all, preparing people specifically to go out and get jobs in the arts. And I think that very regularly at the end of Zoom calls, I'm like, we're not going to solve capitalism today. And it's silly, but it's also true. Students want these jobs. Students are trying to enter these jobs. And there really are spaces for them to make money, make an impact, a social impact even. But one of the things that I do in that space is, in all of my classes, I talk about precarity. So talking about what precarious jobs are, how those look, and how that differs from other jobs. So again, as a sociologist of work, I would say that we're all in this space at this point, and that it doesn't really matter what, if you're an attorney, if you're a doctor, everyone has to deal with this to some degree. But I certainly I show them the numbers about kind of what this looks like and some potential strategies for overcoming at least the most common ways that people could fall into precarity. So that's one end. On the other, so I haven't worked a lot with corporate partnerships. I have worked a lot with family foundations. So people who have funded initiatives like the Barnett Center. Every level of my education and employment has been funded by a family foundation. So I've had some living donors, some, kind of in perpetuity legacy foundations. And I think it's something that academics do have to think about, especially in terms of, academic freedom. Do you feel that this partnership is well aligned with your mission? And thankfully, I think that, my kind of proposition is that people can have strong jobs in the arts. I think that that's a really fundable idea. I think that aligns really well with some corporate interests, a lot of family foundation type interests. So I think that for me, that hasn't been as much of a challenge. I could see it being a challenge for spaces that are not necessarily aligned with like preparing workers for a labor market. But luckily I've found good spaces with that. But I think again, you know, you do need to be thoughtful about how your academic freedom kind of intersects with special funding initiatives.
All right. Rachel Skaggs from The Ohio State University's Barnett Center. Rachel, I am such a fan of yours. I can't even believe that you're only in the third year of your professorship. You're such an interesting, like, productive scholar. You can count me as a fan of your work. And
Thank you.
I look forward to chatting about your research next week we're recording next week on the podcast. It'll get out when it
Yeah.
gets out. We have a pretty loose production schedule over here at Queen's College, but it was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you. I love getting a time to talk about this part of the work that doesn't always get talked about.
All right, I'm going to end the live stream and I'm pressing it, but we're just going to give it a couple seconds. So don't say anything self-incriminating